August 20th, 1945. Yokohama harbor still smoldered, cranes twisted into skeletons against a hazy sky. The air was thick with the sour scent of ash and sea salt, the silence broken only by gulls and the groan of barges unloading supplies for the occupying forces. On a dock, cordoned by American MPs, a group of Japanese women in faded khaki uniforms stood together, clutching small bundles of belongings. They were auxiliaries of the Imperial Army, clerks, nurses and signal operators who had been swept up in the collapse after Japan's surrender. Rumor had clung to them for weeks. The Americans would treat them harshly, perhaps starve them, perhaps worse. In hushed tones, they recalled the training lectures that had prepared them for capture. "The foreign devils will use you until you die," their instructors had warned. "Better to end your life than fall into their hands." Yet here they were, trembling but alive, waiting for orders. Sergeant Harold McKinney of the 11th Airborne Division recorded in his diary, "They looked ready to faint, some hardly more than girls. We'd been told to expect fanatics, but what I saw were worn-out women staring at us like we were executioners." The first command came, not shouted, but spoken through an interpreter. They were to board trucks for transport to a processing station. No blows, no humiliation. Just an orderly march, boots crunching against rubble. For the women, each step was a contradiction. Where was the cruelty they had been promised? Where was the hunger, the degradation? 2 days later, the women found themselves aboard a Liberty ship bound for the United States. The voyage itself felt surreal. The ship, vast and noisy, reeked of oil and steel. In a section converted for female prisoners, they were given bunks, thin mattresses and blankets. A bucket of apples sat on a table. One woman, Lieutenant Keiko Yamamoto, whispered to her bunkmate, "It must be a trick, they will starve us later." But starvation never came. Instead, trays of food arrived at regular hours: powdered eggs, corned beef, rice, even fruit when available. Yamamoto, who had rationed her family's meals to little more than millet and watery soup in the final months of war, stared in disbelief at the pile of white bread on her plate. She wrote in a secret scrap of paper, "Bread so soft it dissolves on the tongue. Meat every day. This is not possible." The Americans guarding them treated the delivery as routine. No gloating, no boasting, just the monotony of military procedure. That indifference was almost more shattering than kindness. For women who had braced for torment, being ignored was unimaginable. The crossing lasted 12 days. Storms battered the vessel, and seasickness left many prisoners pale and weak. Still, the Americans provided medicine. An army nurse checked on them, offering aspirin and nausea tablets through an interpreter. "She smiled as she gave them to us," Yamamoto recalled. A smile at such a time felt like an impossible gift. At night, the women heard swing music from the deck above. Sailors laughed, smoked, and danced to a phonograph. To Japanese ears, dulled by years of air raid sirens and silence, the sound of music in wartime was otherworldly. It was a reminder that while their homeland burned, America sang. On September 1st, the Liberty ship steamed into San Francisco Bay. Fog clung to the water, parting slowly to reveal the towers of the Golden Gate Bridge. The women crowded at the rail, speechless. Below, the docks throbbed with cranes, trucks, and warehouses larger than any facility they had ever seen. From the pier, Private Donald Reese wrote in a letter, "They gawked at everything. Couldn't believe the cars lined up, the lights burning in broad daylight, the sheer size of it all. One of them pointed at a billboard for soap and stared like it was a palace." The prisoners were marched onto trains bound inland. To their shock, the cars were not freight wagons, but passenger coaches with upholstered seats and ceiling fans. Guards handed out canteens of water and even apologized for the heat. The women sat stiff-backed, unable to reconcile the reality with the propaganda that had taught them to expect degradation. The train wound east through the American heartland. Outside the windows spread endless fields of corn and wheat, dotted with barns painted red, silos rising against the horizon. At night, towns appeared, streets lit with neon, stores glowing with goods, cars parked at every house. Yamamoto's secret notes captured the moment. Every town brighter than Tokyo ever was. And the shops, we could see through the glass, full of food. They waste light as if the sky itself were theirs to command. The women whispered to each other. Could this abundance be real? Was it a performance staged for their eyes? Yet mile after mile, town after town, the spectacle never ceased. America, they realized, had not merely survived the war, it had thrived. By the time the train reached Arkansas, exhaustion overcame fear. The women were marched into a camp built hastily but sturdily. Barracks of wood with electric lights, mess halls with stainless steel kitchens, showers with hot water. They were assigned bunks, given soap, and directed to dinner. Dinner was barbecue. Real American barbecue. Ribs slow-cooked over wood, baked beans sweet with molasses, bread rolls, coffee, even slices of watermelon for dessert. Smoke clung to the rafters, the aroma of roasted meat filling the mess hall. The women froze at the threshold, eyes wide. They had expected starvation rations, moldy bread, watery soup, perhaps a handful of rice. Instead, before them lay plates heaped with food that smelled like a feast. Yamamoto later wrote, "We thought we would starve. Instead, they fed us like honored guests. It was not kindness, perhaps. It was normal for them. That is what broke us, that such abundance was ordinary." They ate in silence at first, then with trembling urgency, then with laughter that startled even themselves. For the first time since their capture, they were not afraid of hunger. And in that moment, a terrible realization settled over them. The Empire had lied. September 15th, 1945. The Arkansas sun beat down on the pine forests surrounding the camp, the air heavy with cicadas and wood smoke from the kitchens. For the Japanese women inside the wire, daily life had settled into a rhythm that felt both alien and strangely secure. Morning roll call, breakfast in the mess hall, work assignments in the fields or canning sheds, letters home on Red Cross stationery. They had braced for cruelty. What they found was routine. Yet within that routine lay the most devastating truth. America did not fear them, did not hate them, did not even seem to think much about them at all. The mess hall became the theater of their astonishment. At first, the barbecue had seemed a trick, a one-time gesture. But the meals continued, day after day. Eggs and bacon at breakfast, stews with beef and vegetables at lunch. More barbecue on weekends, when the cooks lit great pits outside and slow-smoked pork shoulders until the aroma drifted across the entire compound. Private Samuel Hayes, assigned as a guard, described the scene in a letter home. "They look at the food like it's treasure. I've seen them weep just holding a plate. Some keep pieces of bread hidden in their sleeves, as if it'll be taken away. The hardest thing for them to understand is that there will always be more tomorrow." But for women who had lived through the fire bombing of Tokyo, where rice was measured in handfuls and children fought over sweet potatoes, the sheer wastefulness was incomprehensible. They saw American cooks discard pans of leftovers without hesitation. "Enough food for a village, thrown away as if it were nothing," Yamamoto wrote in her notes. "We starved while they fed prisoners like this. The war was lost before it began." Beyond food, the shock came in the form of amenities. Showers with hot water, soap that smelled of lavender, electric lights left burning at night. In the barracks, fans turned slowly from the ceiling, buzzing against the Arkansas heat. None of this was luxurious by American standards. Yet to women from a nation where electricity was scarce and soap a rarity, it was abundance beyond comprehension. Nurse Aiko Tanaka, who had worked in a Tokyo hospital reduced to treating burns with rags, was stunned by the camp infirmary. Stocked with aspirin, sulfur drugs, even penicillin, it outmatched anything she had seen during the war. "They give these medicines freely, even to us," she whispered to another prisoner. "In Japan, we begged for scraps." Work outside the wire was permitted under guard. The women were taken to local farms to harvest cotton, sweet potatoes, and beans. What struck them was not just the scale of American agriculture, but its casual efficiency. Tractors plowed fields the size of villages. Trucks carried harvests that could have fed entire provinces in Japan. On one farm, they were given lunch alongside the American workers. The farmer's wife laid out sandwiches with thick slices of ham, jars of pickles, pitchers of sweet iced tea. She insisted the prisoners eat first. The women sat stiff and silent, waiting for insult or mockery. None came. The Americans chatted about weather and crops as though sharing a meal with enemies was nothing unusual. Tanaka later recalled, "We were taught Americans were barbarians, that capture meant dishonor, violation, starvation. Yet here we were, eating ham sandwiches and drinking tea with them. The world we believed in had ended." Sundays brought another ritual, barbecues hosted by local church groups for the POWs. Though the women were always under supervision, the atmosphere was astonishingly casual. Volunteers from town would roast pork and chicken, slice pies, pour coffee. Some brought their children, who gawked at the Japanese women as though they were exotic visitors rather than enemies of a few weeks before. One Sunday afternoon, an elderly woman pressed a piece of peach cobbler into Yamamoto's hands. "Eat," she said gently. Yamamoto's eyes filled with tears. She had not tasted sugar in years. She could not reconcile this grandmotherly kindness with the stories she had been told of Americans as beasts. Private Hayes noticed the effect. They're more rattled by kindness than they would be by cruelty. It's like every bite of pie breaks down another wall they built up inside. Evenings in camp revealed another dimension of shock: entertainment. The Americans screened films in the rec hall, westerns, musicals, dramas. The Japanese women sat rigid at first, then slowly let themselves watch. Meet Me in St. Louis left them speechless. A country that could sing about trolley rides and Christmas while fighting a global war. It seemed like fantasy. One of the women, Sachiko Mori, whispered after the screening, "If this is how they live, then what did we fight for?" Letters home became lifelines. In carefully worded sentences, the women reassured their families, "I am safe, I am well, I have food." Some hinted at the strangeness of their captivity. One wrote of meat cooked over fire with sauces that dripped down the fingers, given to us by those we thought demons. Another told her sister, "We are not beaten, not hungry. The guards treat us as though we are ghosts." The American censors, reading these letters, recognized their value. Every word undermined the myths of imperial propaganda. By October, the women no longer expected to starve. They no longer expected abuse. What unsettled them most now was the realization that they were living in a land where barbecue, rich, smoky, endless, was served not as a luxury, but as ordinary fare. In Yamamoto's final entry that autumn, she captured the creeping collapse of her old beliefs. "We were taught honor meant death before capture, yet here we live, eating better than our families at home. We were taught America was weak, divided, corrupt, yet it is strong enough to feed even enemies. I do not know what Japan will become, but I know now we were lied to." December 1945. The first winter of peace in Arkansas brought cold rain, muddy fields, and breath visible in the air each dawn. Inside the camp barracks, Japanese women huddled around iron stoves, steam rising from their laundry lines strung between bunks. Their daily fears of assault and starvation had long since melted away. What remained was disbelief. Disbelief that captivity could look like this. It deepened at Christmas. On December 22nd, trucks from a nearby town arrived, piled with boxes stamped with the American Red Cross. Prisoners gathered in the mess hall, expecting some announcement, perhaps new work details. Instead, chaplains and local volunteers began handing out parcels. Inside, chocolate bars, cigarettes, candy canes, small toiletries, even playing cards. The women froze, staring at the gifts. One whispered, "For us?" as if the words themselves could not make sense. The following day, a choir from the local Baptist church came through the gates. They sang carols in English, then, astonishingly, attempted Silent Night in Japanese. The pronunciation was halting, but the effort broke through. Some of the women wept openly, clutching each other's hands. The Americans did not mock them, they simply sang. The Christmas feast itself was an event the women would remember for the rest of their lives. The mess hall tables groaned under roasted turkeys, hams glazed with honey, platters of barbecue ribs, mashed potatoes, pies, ice cream. Steam fogged the windows, and the smell of roasted meat clung to every wall. Nurse Aiko Tanaka described the moment in a letter later intercepted by censors. "We sat down as prisoners and rose as something else. They gave us more food than our entire ward at home could have seen in a year. They gave us music, light, and laughter. It was not mercy, perhaps. It was simply their way of life. That was the hardest thing to understand. Women who had feared they would waste away in enemy hands instead ate until they were dizzy. They laughed between bites, sang old Japanese songs after dessert, and for the first time since surrender, felt full. The cultural shocks continued. In January, the women were invited to join educational classes alongside male POWs. They attended English lessons, watched lectures on American government, and even saw films about democracy and civil rights. To those raised on imperial censorship, the openness was staggering. One screening of The Grapes of Wrath left them silent for hours. How could America show poverty and injustice to prisoners, and yet remain so confident, so unafraid? In Japan, such criticism of government would have meant imprisonment. Here, it was entertainment. Sachiko Mori whispered afterward, "They show their wounds to the world, and they heal because of it. We hid ours, and they festered." Work outside the wire resumed in spring. The women were taken to farms bursting with life after the harvest, where barbecue returned as a fixture. Farmers slaughtered hogs, roasted them in pits, and offered the meat to prisoners and guards alike. For the Japanese women, barbecue became a symbol of abundance, of routine, of a culture so confident in its resources that it could share even with enemies. One afternoon, a farmer's wife handed Yamamoto a plate stacked high with pork, beans, and cornbread. "Eat," she said with a smile. Yamamoto later wrote, "I thought of my mother boiling weeds in Tokyo, of my sister bartering kimonos for rice, and here I was, eating like a guest at a feast. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to cling to pride. But hunger and truth broke me. I ate and I wept." By summer 1946, the women's disbelief had matured into a painful clarity. They understood the war had been lost, not simply on battlefields, but in kitchens, farms, and factories. America's strength was not only in bombs, but in its capacity to feed, clothe, and even entertain enemies without strain. The barbecue, the pies, the endless bread, these were not luxuries, but ordinary meals. And that ordinariness was crushing. Repatriation began in late 1946. The women boarded trains once more, carrying Red Cross parcels and photographs taken with American guards. On the docks of San Francisco, as they prepared to sail west, many stood in silence, watching the skyline glitter with lights that no blackout had ever dimmed. One of them murmured, "We thought we would starve. Instead, we leave heavier than we arrived." Another answered quietly, "We thought they were demons. They were only people, and stronger than we imagined." Decades later, historians interviewed survivors. The memories remained vivid. The smoke of barbecue pits, the sweetness of Coca-Cola, the shock of gifts at Christmas. Again and again, the women returned to the same refrain. It was not cruelty that broke them, but generosity. Lieutenant Yamamoto, in an interview given in the 1970s, put it most clearly. "We prepared to die of hunger, of dishonor. Instead, we were fed until our bellies ached." That was when I understood. Our empire had lied. The Americans had already won, not because they starved us, but because they did not need to. The story of the Japanese female POWs reveals a paradox. In the very act of captivity, they found their illusions undone. They discovered that restraint could be more devastating than violence, that barbecue could be more persuasive than propaganda, and that abundance could be the sharpest weapon of all. For them, the smell of hickory smoke, the taste of sauce and pork, became forever tied to the realization that the world they had believed in was gone. And in its place stood a truth they could never unsee. America's greatest power was not in conquest, but in creation.